Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and it is my pleasure to have Addison Brasil with us today. Addison is the author of The First Year of Grief Club, a gift from a friend who gets it. In the past, he was producer and co-founder of the world's first peer men's mental health app called Tethr, Tethr. Addison, it's so great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So we know each other from a mastermind called Metal, Media Entertainment Technology Alpha Leaders, and um, I'm curious what brought you into Metal, and yeah, if you wanted to share any kind of insights or epiphanies or synchronicities that happened because you were in Metal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at that time, I mean, that was the height of the pandemic. That was like lockdowns when I joined. So my whole knowledge of metal was all within the digital world, which started to allow people from all over, not just California, to connect, which was really cool. And at the time, a couple members of metal had taken notice of everything I was doing sort of in the men's mental health movement. And they just kind of suggested it. And as you know, happens, I came to one Saturday and got to meet with a bunch of people in the breakout rooms and hear the guests talk, and that led to many, many more Saturdays and many friendships and many connections and working with people and co-mentoring and yeah, it really was a really cool experience. I mean, this is proof of that, right?
Right. So we're having this conversation today because of it. There's so many kind of just magic moments that happen in different masterminds where it's clear to me that this is somebody I need to have on my podcast, or this is somebody who's going to become some sort of strategic partner or strategic alliance or whatever. They just kind of light up in some way, like not necessarily physically, but metaphorically. And you were one of
Mm-hmm.
them. So when your book came out, I knew that I needed to talk to you about grief on this show. And there aren't very many episodes where we talk about grief. So it's an important topic. It's one that I think people shy away from unless they're
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of it. They don't feel a need for it. But death is an ever present part of life. And that's what makes life, just what it is something that is precious. And if if we don't look at that, I think we miss something that is a critical part of life. There are folks who have a coin in their pocket everywhere they go that I forget what it says exactly, but I think it's something like memento mori or something like that. Essentially,
Mm-hmm.
reminding them that they're going to die. They're mortal. At least their physical body is mortal. And I don't know if that's something that appeals to you to remember that, or if it was you were just kind of thrust into this situation of needing to deal with grief because of circumstances. But I'm curious to hear a bit more about your story.
Yeah, and yeah, for those listening, my personal story, I guess, I yeah, my coin is experiential in a sense of it's something that I can never really shed or forget at home. Um, and it's interesting because I found myself in, between 19 and 29, just to the left of death three times. I lost my younger brother to an inoperable brain tumor at 19. And then a few years later, I found my father after his suicide. And
Mm-hmm.
then a few years after that, and that was kind of after kind of going out into the world and really trying to fix what had happened, really just looking for like, how do I fix this? How do I fix grief? How do I fix mental health? And I think at 27 in LA, I think I kind of thought I did it. And I thought I was going to just sort of move on and it was checked and it would be fine. I had downloaded a meditation app and been to enough therapy, so it should be over kind of idea. And I actually like was out celebrating one night in Los Angeles, that feeling that I just kind of felt like I was back, and it was kind of up from here. And on the way home one evening, I was in a really bad accident that killed a dear friend of mine, and left me relearning to walk, and with a brain injury, and just really at that point having to make sense of the world again. So it's odd. Some people look in and say you're the unluckiest guy I've ever met, and some people look in and say, well, you were always still here, so maybe you're the luckiest guy I've ever met. You're just sort of just to the left of this. So experiencing death and then the grief after that in such complex and comparative ways kind of allows me to be this 33-year-old who writes a grief book. Which, because most people, when I say that in passing, are like, what do you know about grief, kind of thing. They're like kind of taken aback. But as we get to know each other, we realize that everybody's stories are a little different, and mine, as well as having gratitude and awe and so much love in there, does have some pretty difficult grief processes that I've been honoring.
Hmm. So you said making sense of the world.
Hmm.
Curious to hear if you've made sense of the world, and what does that mean exactly? If we were to unpack that, what does make sense and what doesn't?
That is a good question. I've never been asked that, and that is one of those things, like sort of like a clip. I always say those words, and it's so interesting. Nobody has ever plucked them out and asked me what exactly that means. I think that where we get to is after this accident. It was sort of like I realized my whole life had been running on one operating system, and now I was using a different system. I say it's like I was trying to run Mac on Windows, and it just was not going to work. Everything that I believed and everything I thought about the world really did shift with that third sort of big event. And I think what I came to realize, and the reason I wanted to write the book in the end, was that this really isn't something you fix. It's something you honor, and honoring it is getting up every day and checking in with yourself, and based on the relationship you have with this grief and the people that you've lost and what you need to do in your day, adapting and using different parts of your toolkit to get through the day. So I had to really surrender and let go. I thought at almost a suicidal moment after the accident that I was not going to be here, but what I realized was I really had to let go of just all these things that I thought were going to serve me that just were not. These ideas of how the world worked, and someone who thought they could make sense of it. It's funny because that's at that point where I thought I could make sense of everything. It was something I could achieve and fix and move forward. And it is an interesting question, because it was in no longer trying to make sense of it in that way, and feeling okay and safe in the, like, there's no way to know. We really do just have the present moment.
Hmm. Yeah, something I learned recently. Actually, I interviewed this. He's a popular YouTuber, and well, fairly popular, and a psychic. His name is Sam the Illusionist. And in one of his channelings, I watched this video of him channeling, and it was very profound. They said that the present moment is not what we're currently experiencing. What we're experiencing through our five senses is actually in the past. It has already happened. The way that we
Hmm.
get into the present moment is by shutting
And is that
out
in
our five
seconds?
senses and going. I didn't get the detail around that. See, the thing is about time is
Very
time doesn't
interesting.
exist. It's an illusion. Past, present, and future all happen simultaneously.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's a lot to wrap one's head around. But this little nuance, this distinction I learned recently about the present moment not being what we think it is when we are being all present, right? And listening to the birds
Mm-hmm.
chirping and feeling our feet on the grass and everything. That's not present moment. That's an echo. Yeah, yeah. So if you want to experience the present moment, you have to shut out the five senses. You have to go within and just quiet everything, and then it's the present moment.
Hmm.
Joe Dispenza talks about meditating in this place where you're in the unified field, experiencing yourself as nobody in no time and nowhere
Hmm.
and no thing, right? That's the
Hmm.
present moment.
I
That
get
is
that.
when
That really
you are
makes sense.
in
Yeah.
the moment. Yeah. And what a powerful distinction to think, oh, I'm getting present right now because I'm really feeling my feelings. I'm really taking in deeply what my five senses are giving me. No, that's all an echo.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a beautiful metaphor for anyone listening who maybe hasn't had a close brush with grief. That's a lot what it feels like. Something that you always thought you knew, or a concept you thought you had figured out, and then you sharing that, me having to rethink something that I say and do all the time. It's like such a good metaphor for that sort of system interrupt that happens when when you lose something meaningful. You're just kind of like, wait, I thought I knew what this was. And it's like, no, the game has changed completely. I think it's a great way for people who are coming to this, not from a place of need, like you said off the top, to, and already grieving, but maybe just interested in it and, how it affects those around them.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. So, did you have a near-death experience, an NDE, where you felt this connection to something more on the other side, you know on the other side of the veil, or did something meaningful happen for you?
I have never personally had, yeah, no near death experience. I have been what I believe to be very close to suicide, and I could speak about that and the awareness around that, and that sort of cloud that I went into. But as far as my own near death experience, no, I guess I've just intimately, witnessed, which is quite rare, but not rare, like, people actually leaving this earth, people I care deeply about being right there, sort of when it happened,
Mm.
or right before, right after, just kind of being in that space. And yeah, I've never personally had a near death experience, though. I'm going to knock on everything
Have you
because
known
my biography
somebody
is
who's
already long
right?
enough.
Okay. So, do you know anybody who's had an NDE and then they report back like, "Wow, this is so different
I
from what I thought
I've
it was."
heard a few different people. One thing that just comes up in my mind is I got to get close with Kevin Hines when I was involved in the men's mental health movement, and he's one of the few people that jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. I don't know if you've ever interviewed
Mhm.
him, actually. He's a
Oh,
fascinating
I want to.
story. But
He's on my list. Yeah.
I'll have to connect you guys.
Oh,
He's
I'd
one
love
of
that.
those
Yeah.
people that so few people survive that jump, and that he said, like, the way he said that he had this immediate regret, and then his experience in the water, it was just very moving to hear that story. I always think of that, and I've thought about Kevin
Mm.
a lot, even in my own struggles, um, just the fact that he was willing to share that in the experience he had. But
Yeah.
yeah, other than that, no, not
I could
really,
share
I
something
guess.
about Kevin.
Yeah.
So I recently watched a short video about him,
Mm.
and at the moment, when you get these goosebumps, it's like whoa, some like
Mm-hmm.
you get this electric sort of feeling throughout your body. That some people refer to those as angel bumps because that's the
Mm.
confirmation from above that this is true, this is real. So when I heard the part of the story about the seal,
The seal, yeah.
or was a sea lion, one or the other,
Seal, yeah.
pushing him up from below, a seal keeping him alive because he didn't have the energy to keep his head above water for a
Mm-hmm.
number of minutes until he could be saved. I had the
Yeah.
thought, even before I completed the thought in my mind of like the, uh, formulating it into a sentence in my head. I just had the thought like that was either an angel essentially like hijacking the seal's body to do this miracle, or it was um, an animal instructed to do this. Either way, it's basically the same thing, right? So
Yeah,
being
it's
delivered a
it's beautiful
miracle
too, and it, like for me, it
because
really,
it's not
yeah,
your time.
speaks to that. Exactly. And it speaks to that idea of how, connected we are with everything, and it's like,
Yeah.
some sort of message was sent out and a living being showed up at the absolutely necessary moment. And I think that's like, for me, that's been the glue through all this grief, is when that signal that I seem to be sending out without ever knowing, when I'm in distress, when this does become overwhelming, when the grief was too much, I call it magic, but it's sort of that same thing. That seal for me is all these people that always kind of showed up right at the right moment, and it almost seems like it can't be a coincidence. Like, there's that connectedness to responding to someone's need like that. And I love that. I feel like I've had so many seals. I love that story, and just I've heard him
Mm-hmm.
tell it many times, and he's very good at telling it, because even when I know the story, I still, like, get, like you said, goosebumps or angel bumps, and you're just so moved by it. It's a very
Yeah.
interesting story.
Yeah. And I've found that as my psychic abilities continued to develop, that I can communicate with the animals,
Hmm.
at a telepathic level. And wow, they have so much to say, and they have so much wisdom. We don't give
Okay.
animals nearly enough credit. Yeah,
Yeah, I really
it's
believe that
amazing.
too. I
So,
got my dog right after the accident, and it is insane how aware of his purpose he is. Like, he knew exactly why he was there, and just the connectedness, and if it were any other time, he probably would have been like a little more rambunctious, or a little, and I had broken my hip at the time, and he would always curl around that exact hip and rest his head on that hip. It was just like, the knowing is just, yeah, my little buddy.
well, how's this for wild? What if he had volunteered to be there for you through this experience before he even incarnated?
It's possible. I believe that. I'd be down for that.
Yeah. So there's this concept called soul contracts. And if you can believe that we actually choose our parents, we choose our um, our soulmates, our best friends, our business partners, children. We have this kind of vision of uh, or map of what our life is going to be like before we incarnate, and what the lessons are going to be, what the hardships and the big breakthroughs are going to be. And you might have somebody in your life who is just, uh, they're really hard to take.
Hmm.
And they chose and agreed to be in your life to serve an essential purpose for you of giving you that contrast and that opportunity to grow and forgive and love unconditionally. There are no accidents. There are no chance occurrences. There's nothing random. It's what I've been shown. And so if you can find some solace or peace in the fact that you opted in for whatever challenges you've faced, and that the people and the animals that rally around you to support you through this all opted in as well,
Hmm.
it's not so far fetched.
No, it's a beautiful thought, and for me personally, like, as I said, the way that I've always been supported and surrounded by community, um, I'm glad to feel like a lot of people opted in, because it felt like a lot going on when it was happening. but it's certainly, yeah, that's, I mean, that brings me peace that the next person it might not, but I love that idea. And that that kind of never, you were never alone idea of that it started long ago.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. The episode where I interviewed Vasindra Gupta, we went pretty deep into soul contracts. So
Mhm.
if that interests you, or if our listener is interested in digging deeper into that, I'd check that episode out, and also the article she wrote for
Hmm.
her blog called my. The blog is called My Spiritual Shenanigans, and the article is all about soul contracts. Yeah, that's how I
Very
ended up
cool.
contacting her, was finding that article online, which again wasn't an accident, and knowing that, oh, she's somebody that I'm supposed to have on the show. Yeah, really powerful, really, really powerful.
I love that.
So there's a concept I want to share with you, and I want to get your take on it. If you think of us as kind of like dumb terminals, if you can think back to earlier days of computing, where we were using dumb terminals to connect to supercomputers, and the supercomputer had all the answers and all the information, but the dumb terminal is how you connected to it. And the dumb terminal by itself didn't have enough um, smarts to answer really any questions, but it gave you the conduit.
Hmm.
And if you think of ourselves in that scenario as kind of the dumb terminal connecting to the unified field, or to source, or to all that is, that supercomputer, uh, then people getting into altered states of consciousness, doing plant medicine, or doing breath work, meditation, and so forth, and getting connected to the place of nobody, no thing, no time, nowhere. Now they're connected to the supercomputer. And I'm curious to hear if you have had any experiences where you felt plugged into that.
Ooh, um, gosh, at the end of my day here in London, listeners, I should have thought harder when I hopped on here that it was gonna go deep and get real, not just be an easy book interview. Metal Brothers, never. Um, yes, I have, and I think that when I speak a lot and when I write a lot, as I kind of said earlier, I refer to that as like the magic, this like undefinable thing. I think for myself and for many that I've spoken to, I've gotten to speak to hundreds of people that have dealt, with grief. eh, I, it does call into question everything you believe, whether you started out very religious or if you're spiritual or whatever. And it's not uncommon for a lot of people to go through a chunk of time where they consider themselves almost like atheist, where they just kind of disconnect from everything. Um, and I did have that. I had a really bad PTSD after finding my father after his suicide. And there was something in my being that had to shut down everything I had always felt deeply connected to. Because if sort of the visions and the trauma, the projections from the trauma were real, then that was real. And I kind of had to get rid of everything in order to just know what was actually happening. And it was actually just such a lonely, lonely time. And I I find personally when I feel the most connected to that is sort of what's always inspired me is like when you're watching a movie or you're listening to music or you're at like a theater with other people and there's just this moment where you take like this deep breath and it's like whew, whoever wrote that line or that lyric or the way that music was played, the way that violinist is moving, they know what I know. And we don't have to talk about it, but I know that I'm not alone. As isolating as everybody can make what I've been through sound, there's just that. And I've always had this, that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to create the opportunities for that gasp to connect people without having to communicate. And I think that's because I was also very shy when I was young, around a big outgoing family. But this idea of that connection, and so that's when I feel connection on that level, is when I'm connected to some sort of deep kindness or universal understanding that kind of goes unsaid. And I have to say, those are the moments that I live for. That, and for me, I have this thing, and you might call it telepathic, I don't know, but I really can tap into other people's sense of humor and sort of not hear their thoughts, but I know exactly where they're at, and I know the kind of real tickle spot of people's senses of humor. And it's been a great joy for me amidst the sadness that I've experienced. And when I can really connect into what's the funny, like we're talking laugh until you cry, the person is gasping for air, and because of that I am too, that is probably the most plugged in, alive, connected on earth, that I get to feel. I almost source that out. Like I almost want to go to funerals where I know someone's going to laugh with me, like, when we're not supposed to, because it's just that is when I definitely feel the most connected to, like, this idea that yes, everything's so serious and we're here, and everything our bodies and our minds experience are so serious, but also it's just so much bigger than that. And there's those moments of complete release, kind of like you say, where you're in a sense, it's kind of the same as, like you said, taking the senses away. When I'm laughing like that, I also don't have really any of my senses. It's like you lose control of everything and you're just in the visceral of human connection. um
Mm.
so yeah,
Can you give an
that, and when
example of
I
that?
witnessed
Like,
deep kindness. Yeah.
can you give an
I mean,
example
for
where
the
you had that connection with somebody and it was just like awesome and hilarious?
Yeah, yeah. There's so many, and I don't even like. It's so weird because it's so particular. But like my older sister, she's 3 years older than me, but people kind of call us twins, and some people call us the evil twins, because we can hear each other's thoughts like this. And here we were, front and center, losing our brother, and then our father in a very tragic way. And everyone sort of has an expectation of what grief looks like and how you deal with these things. And for me and my sister, especially in private, we spent a lot of our time, and she won't mind me sharing this, but hysterically laughing, because it would just be the smallest thing that we could both find funny, or the weirdest thing. And it's just so odd the way that everything goes when you're dealing with death. So to be able to just have those moments, and it's like that with my sister, it's like, don't you dare look at me, don't you dare, don't look at me, I know what you're thinking, I know what you're going to do. And it's just like, it doesn't matter if you're in church, it doesn't matter what you're doing, it's just, okay, this is happening and this laughing fit is going to occur. And that, like, you can see from the way that I light up, I mean, that's just where I tap into the deepest sense of connection. And it makes sense, like, sort of, that people see that as sort of like this twin thing, because for us, we don't even have to talk, we can tap right into what we know, what either one would have said in the inappropriate situation, and where it would have gone really quickly. So it's this really beautiful thing, and I feel really lucky that I get to have that with so many people. I'm really like, I really love comedy, I always have. Like, I went all the way through the groundling school in LA, well, navigating grief. So I'm dealing with all this heavy stuff, but then I'm also doing full improv shows off one word suggestions, and just figuring out what really works and what makes people laugh, and connecting with other people and listening deeply. So I think it's just like this thing that I'm sort of addicted to, is like, I know the deepest sadness in a way in my own life, but like, let's tap into your deepest joy, or what's going to really get you going. And it's sort of like my weird hobby where people are like, get out of my head, and I'm like, oh no, I have you now. I have you now, we'll never be able to sit through anything serious again. And you get to a point where I don't even have to say anything, I just look, and the person knows that I know whatever they're thinking. And it's just, it's magical, because it's just, you're just so deeply connected. And I just love humor for that.
Mm. Wow, that's awesome. And to have um, that level of connection with somebody is really, it's beautiful. It's so much
Hmm.
more than just a parlor trick or kind of fun or funny. It's profound.
Hmm. I agree.
Yeah.
I
And
agree.
I'm
It's
curious to hear if you have had situations where you sense something beyond just like, oh, I get you, like we're on the same wavelength or whatever. We're like, um, I don't know, we're plugged in, connected. but you're like, wow, this person is thinking about taking their own life. I better talk to them about um,
Hmm.
why suicide is not the answer, or I need to intervene. I need to deliver a miracle right now. Have you
Hmm.
had that happen?
Yeah, I've had it, and I've witnessed it very intimately. When my brother was at the end of his life with a brain tumor, he had been palliative for a while. He'd already stopped speaking, but when it came towards what we believed would be the end, the doctors and that came by and the nurse kind of said, this is going to be a really long week. Like this is, we have time here, so rest and come back to the bedside kind of thing. This isn't going to happen tonight kind of thing. And my mom's like connection to my brother, it was visceral. And the night before he passed, which again they had told us like to rest, not to like react, and she had this whole episode and she was just so sure, she just knew it was so soon. And that, so we stayed up as late as we could and we watched movies with my brother, and then we all went to bed. And then a couple hours later my mom's best friend came in and woke me up and said, your mom thinks you should come in and say goodbye. She's really sure. And it was this weird thing because I actually was going to college at time. My roommate's mother was a nurse, and she had told me that once certain extremities go cold, there's still probably 72 hours. So I had this idea of there were 72 hours, and it had been maybe 12 since she told me that. And I was just kind of nervous about a week full of like going to the bedside to say goodbyes. Like it's just it was a lot. But my mom was so sure, and I came in, and my parents were divorced, and she said, I think you should call your dad. And I kind of had this hesitancy in the way she looked at me. I said, okay. And so I called my dad and I said, it's time. Mom thinks it's time. Come now, kind of thing. And we all were in my brother's room, and we were all kind of talking to him and listening to his favorite music. And my dad, 15 minutes later, walked in the house, came up the stairs, walked in the room, picked up my brother's head and told him that he loved him. And by the time he put my brother's head down, my brother had passed away. And it was, it was to me at the time, the word I would have used is insane, which is not a word that I use. But my mother's connection to her children is like nothing I've ever seen. But that was, almost to the minute, and just so sure. Like it just, and that's was just like, whoa, there's something way beyond us, and sort of who, our attachments and the way that we're all connected to each other. And this is all I've known that. I mean, my mom, like, I can walk by and be walking funny apparently, and she knows that something's going on, so deeply connected. But then for myself, a few years later, I was the only one really close with my dad near the end of his life, just because of distance. My older sister lived in Australia, and he was divorced for a second time, so I was the only really close. And I had this literal visceral feeling in my chest that, and I started to get vocal about it and tell a few people and my mom, and I was just so sure that something was wrong. But my dad had just sort of started to act a little odd. It would, like people said, if he was, be months before he was that depressed or before anything serious would happen. And I was trying to talk about it with everyone, and keep in mind this is actually almost 10 years to the day. It was 10 years on the Saturday. The conversations, especially around men's mental health, were not happening, luckily, like we have them today. But I just had this feeling, and to the point that I actually had my mom have my grandfather over for dinner 2 days before my father died, because I thought, okay, maybe it's grandpa, but I'm sure, I just know something's about to happen. And we were sitting having dinner, and my mom was like, what? And I looked over, I said, it's not him. It's not him. And I don't know, because I never got official timing, but the next night, in the middle of the night, I was sleeping at a friend's house, and I woke up at 3 a.m, which works probably out with the timing, and I just gasped, and I just knew something had happened. And my friend was like, don't worry, go back to sleep. And the next morning I found my father, after he had died. But that feeling, I've talked about this before, it curdled in my chest, and I followed that feeling in that 2-week course to my dad. Like that's where it was leading. And it scares me, that the connection I had, because I obviously never want to have that feeling again. because it was so real and it was so deeply connected. But I think much like in Kevin's story and like what we were talking about earlier, I was I was empathetically connected like my mom was to my dad's suffering, no matter how much he was trying to shield it from me. And I just was very, very aware that literally a part of me, there was something not right, you know, and and it was absolutely right. And I've had my years of therapy of wanting to have rung the alarm bell sooner, but I was a 23-year-old trying to respect the the mental health and the privacy of a grown man. And like I said, 10 years ago, it's a very different conversation. You're not educated. And so one thing I really inherited from my father was that mental health education and that responsibility around it. And the likelihood of me ending up in that same situation, because he navigated it blind, not living in the world we live in now, that was really my inheritance on a spiritual level. Was you really got to take care of yourself, and kind of go out into the world and figure out what really serves you and what doesn't, and not stop until it's the real thing for you,
Right. And so that led you to create that mental health app, Tethr. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a really big inspiring factor. And Tether was this magical thing that I got to do for 2 years and be a part of this movement. And my story really got highlighted in that. And I realized in that process, my father really wasn't alone, especially statistically, like right at his age and demographic. Like he was 50 at the time, and that's one of the most at risk for suicide. But just getting in those 2 years to speak to, interview, and connect with thousands of men across the world that were willing to show up and engage around mental health or well-being, or just brotherhood, much like we were talking about in the beginning with metal. It was just so fascinating to realize again, like how deeply connected we really all are. And much of what I learned in that space lends itself to where I came to when I wrote the book, in terms of how can I be a friend to others? How can I stay in the space of stretching what an everyman can do? I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to be a coach. I don't want to, be a grief expert. I want to show what an everyday man can do and how they can thrive and what they can learn and how they can experiment and get help. Because the second I sort of crossed a bridge and became, a doctor or a coach, or then I wasn't in this kind of cool life experiment I like to be in, of stretching, like what can an everyday man really do? How much further can we stretch from what my dad thought was possible? So that was just such a really cool experience to be a part of that, and then to sort of come off of that and sort of have this download of exactly what I would want to offer somebody if I just found out they lost someone. For that download to come through after 13 years, everyone's like, oh, you wrote this book so quick. And I'm like, well, it's like 13 years and 2 months. Like it's, that download and that responsibility of, well, what would I really say? And it's funny, every time anybody would ever call me and say, so-and-so's lost someone, will you talk to them? Or I've lost, someone so close to me and they're heartbroken, I really would freeze. And part of writing this book was out of that discomfort. That freeze eventually kind of became this pull to be like, okay, well, if you're uncomfortable with single sentence condolences, or sending flowers that will die, or joining the casserole, party, what are you comfortable with? And it was like, I'd want to be with them for a year. But also, I don't want to sit in anyone's grief for a year, because I've been in the arena for 13 years myself. So what is the way that I could be gifted to other people and stay with them for a year and encourage them not to get through the loss, but to get to know themselves again with the loss, is the biggest thing. I think people try to spend so much time focusing on how to live without someone, and so much of it for me is learning to live with yourself within the loss, and learning what works for you, and being willing to meet yourself where you're actually at now, and not sort of trying to return to this idea of when everything was perfect, or when you last felt right, or a time really quite innocently when they were alive, because that's a version of you that would line up best with this not happening, you know? um I get that. So that's kind of how it, you know, the men's mental health stuff really infused the way I looked at that, and learning that men learn experientially, shoulder to shoulder, from witnessing other people experience was very powerful for me, because that's how I learned, you know, as other people who had really been in it, that I wasn't necessarily paying to talk to me, that were sharing their tools and sharing what worked for them. And I was able to kind of go into my own corner and experiment and go, okay, what's my version of that? You know, what really serves me here? What am I tossing and what am I refining? And so that was just like such a cool experience to sort of bridge those together and birth this baby book.
Wow. You know that you said it took 2 months, but then 13 years in the making to get to the 2 months. That reminded me of uh, I learned recently that The Alchemist was written in 12 days. 150 million
Wow.
copies sold, and it was written in 12 days.
You know,
Yeah.
it's that weird rare thing, and I don't even want to say this because I don't want to perpetuate, because we did so much writing and I was in the midst of writing my memoir, another project, and this book fell out of that. You know, working with an editor and a coach on that, and this book sort of fell out of that. So I was in the practice of writing and refining, and I have been. That's always been one of the ways that I deal with and honor everything I'm going through is writing. But it is, I've heard this experience a lot, where when the time comes, though, the sort of first draft, which then, if anyone's being honest, is, you know, revised a lot, but it is sort of this download, this clarity, this connection. And when you asked earlier when you felt that connected, it was a lot like that. It was 37 hours. And I use the metaphor of a baby being born. It was like, I've been wanting to write this book for 13 years. And it was like, I was in London and I was like, oh, my water just broke. Like, I was like, it's happening. And I just sat down and there was paper everywhere. It's like silly. It was like a movie, you know, the paper and the computer's out and I'm mapping it and moving things around and going, oh my gosh, this is what I would actually say to a friend. This is what I actually would offer. And it was like, why didn't you do this earlier? And it's like, this is the moment. There was never a moment. And I like the metaphor of a baby being born, because you can't call it, you know, unless you like schedule a C-section. But like, you know, you really can't call that, and you can't look at a mother and say, well, why didn't you do it on this day? Like, that's not how it works. When it's time, it's time. And it was very much that experience for me. And I've spoken to other few authors where, you know, years of preparation and experience, but then when the time comes, it like sort of the dams break in that way. And I'll happily admit, as a millennial, that it had a lot to do with the fact that the Wi-Fi was broken and I had no cell service and nobody asked me on a date or to go drinking that night. And it, like, I think it cracked me open a little bit to just finally be so disconnected and have this thing that was right there, you know. I posted a joking video the next week saying thank you to everybody who didn't ask me on a date last Friday night, because I finally, you know, gave birth. You know, that was like because we have so many distractions. It's difficult. We really, and
Yeah.
especially with grief, you know, we want to do anything other than to really tap into that, you know. So we have all these magical dopamine rush products available to us, and sometimes it's okay to just take the time. And, you know, Mary Frances O'Connor, who's the neurobiologist who wrote The Grieving Brain, she says, like, avoidance is a tool in your toolkit. And as long, you know, sometimes it serves you in the beginning through what would be way too difficult for you to handle. It's just knowing when you're moving to the next tool, you know. And I think you're not ready till you're ready in some ways with this stuff.
Right. Well, you know that the Wi-Fi not working and cell service, that was all arranged for you. You
You
realize
know,
that,
and it's
right?
so funny because I like, yeah, and for anyone listening, it's like sometimes when you've had a lot of death, it's there's a resistance to that idea, you know, because it feels like there's a greater plan. And, you know, it's like, well, I want to talk to whoever wrote this plan out because my brother and my dad aren't here, you know. And it's like, but at the same time, as you say that, I want to be devil's advocate with my own self, which is basically my everyday life, is me doing this back and forth with myself, is, you know, saying it did feel very aligned, you know, and it did happen exactly when it was supposed to happen. And you know, anyone who's been through a lot of grief probably hates as much as I did everything happens for a reason. And I like to flip that and say, you can still be the reason everything happens, and kind
Mm.
of tap back into your own trajectory and your own life. Because everything happens for a reason kind of feels a little bit more like what happened around you, but being the reason everything still happens allows you to kind of step into your own trajectory.
Mm.
And for me, that worked. And, that's kind of what I'm going for in the book, is this idea of, I'm not telling you anything. I'm just getting you to experiment weekly with different ideas and figuring out what works for you, and what serves you. And I would say, just like, whenever you say something like that, I'm realizing I had gotten to a very spiritual point, and maybe I am pulling back a little bit. And every time you kind of say something like divine in that sense, I'm noticing the discomfort in my body, and it's like, oh, okay, that's weird. Because why are you, resistant to that right now? What's happening? And to be honest, it's probably the time of the year, and that I mentioned that anniversary was, it's a time where I'm sort of, re-updating the whole operating system. But I love I love the invitation to always revisit all of these things, because I think the number one thing I tried to do in all of my grief and all my mental health challenges was look for finality and results. And I just realized that it's an everyday conversation, you know, and not encouraging ruminating on end, but being willing to check in and go, on it each and every day with where you're really at, you know, without those five senses. Sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah, and even when you have the five senses going like full full steam, you still can have part of your consciousness in that subspace,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm receiving stuff while we're in the midst of the interview. I
Mm-hmm.
always have part of my listening or my consciousness tuned in to that. Like for example, I wrote this down a while ago. I was debating whether to say it in the episode or after we stopped the recording, but I'll share it now. Your dad waited, or I mean your brother waited for your dad to arrive.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah, I will.
the
I'm gonna.
that's what I'm getting about that.
Well, I love that,
Yeah.
and I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, it's odd. Sometimes things like that, it's days later where what you said clicks in a way. You know what I mean? Like, it's like I've gotten really good at never throwing anything away, because the grief shield does come up, and be like, I don't, um, they're happy and they're gone. That's like kind of what my whole brain is trying to like close in on now. And it's like, okay, just let that download, and some sort of digesting later, something like that gets offered can make so much sense and bring a sense of peace or joy too. So um, I'm always open to hearing that.
Yeah. Do you get any um, communication from your loved ones who have passed?
I dream very, very vividly. And you'd actually be very interested to speak to him. I'll connect you too. But there's a guy named Dr. Black at the University of British Columbia, I believe, and his whole PhD has been studying grief dreams. And it was a very interesting conversation, because I dream so vividly. It's almost like show running 3 Netflix shows every night, all night, in a way that I'm like, I need rest from my rest. It's like, so, and it's all very obvious. And whether or not I take it as, there's been things that felt like very clear messages, um,
Mm-hmm.
and things that don't make sense at all. Um, for instance, my friend who passed in the accident, I never had, like, for someone who dreams the way I do, and my brother and my father are constantly in my dreams in different ways, but she would never in any of my dreams ever. And it was so weird. And then I had one very specific dream where I was driven to like sort of a white house on a hill, and I got out, and it was like a beautiful garden, and she was standing there, and I just walked up to her and I hugged her, and it felt like it lasted forever. But then some, and then I woke up. And for
Mm.
someone who kind of thinks through their sleep. I mean, I went through one of the most horrific ordeals ever with this beautiful friend of mine. You'd think there'd be so many other dreams, especially given just the PTSD of the situation. But that was the only dream I ever had. And so for me, sometimes things like that, whether it leans into me, believing or doing more, or just knowing that I get the messages that I need at the exact right time, it was just, so peaceful and so beautiful. And I've had things like that. I personally, it's funny because I push it away, not because I don't believe in any of it, because I've always felt deeply connected and I don't want to engage. That's sort of like where I've always come at it from, and like that's something that's kind of come up a lot in my life. And kind of feeling like there is some sort of deeper connection, and just going, yeah, I don't want to hear anything. I don't want to, and it's funny because when my dad passed, like I said, with PTSD, it was so hard to decipher what was a deep connection and what was a flashback, and what, and so it had to be very specific, saying, if this is real and I am feeling connected to you, that's fine, but you need to come in the day. I'm terrified, Dad. You're not, like, I don't want you to come now, and I would have these conversations out loud. And again, whether or not I truly believed it was happening or not, the messaging was coming through, and my soul and my body were working through the grief process with the help of those messages. Um, it's also interesting because, like, as I say, grief can be so different and complex, and for me in three different ways. This makes no sense to anybody else, but I have very different ideas of where each of them are, and it doesn't make sense even to me, but it's just what I viscerally know and feel, so I keep what those details are private. But I just, sometimes it doesn't even line up with a central belief system. It's just sort of what you know and feel and energetically can tap into. um, and I do believe with people that you're that close to, that the connection certainly does not die, at death. I feel very
Right.
connected still.
Yeah. Well, the fact that you woke up, uh, the fact that you woke up right at the moment where you were having this really long hug, and it felt so real to you, was not a coincidence. What I understand about loved ones coming in dreams is that, or important messages coming in dreams, either way, the importance of having uh, uh, that that person, or that soul, or the angel, or whoever is communicating with you, wake you up so
Hmm.
you remember the dream. Otherwise you won't. And some people will tout having a dream journal by their bed,
Hmm.
and moving their body as little as possible. Especially don't sit up, and especially don't like move your neck around that much. Just move the least amount as possible to keep that dream, uh, the details, because they'll evaporate really fast, and start scribbling down all the details you can. But that
Hmm.
that was for you, a gift for you, that dream, if you had had it, let's say 30 minutes earlier, and slept through that dream and an additional 30 minutes, you probably wouldn't have remembered it.
Hmm. Yeah, I know,
That
I
was
can attest to
intentional. I
that.
had
I,
a
I
dream
dream
that
all
I
night, every
asked
night,
for.
and dream very little. Sorry, and I remember very little.
You what?
So, yeah. No, I said I dream all
Yeah.
night, every night, as I said, but I remember very little. So it is very special to me how vividly, for instance, I remember that specific memory, and obviously how much
Mm,
it's meant to me.
yeah. Yeah. I lost a cat in 2019 who is very dear to me, and she does
Hmm.
visit me. She's amazing, amazing soul. But there was this one experience that was just so vivid and real, and unlike other dreams, where we were reunited, and I felt so happy, elated, and just grateful. And she let me pet her tummy, which she would never let me do when she was in physical form. And I just felt this beautiful reunion, and that was real. That was not a dream. That was not
Wow.
synapses firing in my brain. That was an experience that was real in the astral plane. And yeah, I was also um, able to remember it because it happened shortly before I woke up. There was another important piece to that needed to happen. Had nothing to do with the reunion. Is more of a warning of
Hmm.
some interference. But that was incredible, and these sorts of things are waiting for us. And oftentimes, all we have to do is ask. Please
Hmm.
come to me in a dream and wake me up so that I remember it. It's that
I
simple.
love that. And I will say that
Yeah.
the messaging is always there for me personally. And it is something that I, through my grief processes and through, my go-to was to shut down. So for anyone listening this who may be earlier in a grief process, what we're talking about as well, like, this is something years and years later that I could open myself up to and feel more deeply connected to, and trust that the messaging was there. And I'm at a place in my life, I talk about this in the very end of the book, where I can accept that I cannot change what happened and still realize some of the true benefits of what I've experienced and how that makes me a fully feeling, fully flawed, empathetic person in the life that I continue to live because I'm still here, and that can take years and years and years, but it is such a beautiful thing when you can sort of be in both worlds and be open to things like that, like the messaging, and just feeling deeply connected to something that may have made no sense at all to you a few years earlier. I know that I'd be raising my hand in that poll of doing things and saying things that I never thought I would, and then on my own journey finding these different ways to be connected.
Mm, yeah. Well said. So if our listener is wanting to go through this grief process or set of processes, they should pick up the book, First Year of Grief Club, a gift from a friend who gets it. Any other resources or recommendations that you would have for them if they wanted something uh, more than just read the book?
Absolutely, yeah. I do want to say about the book too. It's called First Year of Grief Club, and it did make it as something you could give to somebody right away, as a gift right when they experience loss. But it can also be the first year that you choose to experiment within your grief and get to know yourself. So it doesn't have to be in linear time. If you're feeling, ready to really honor a grief that you've been through, it can be from that day into the first year. That's something that I get written about a lot, so I like to clarify. And then mygriefclub.com is being built as we speak more and more. I have been working and been in pre-production myself on a limited podcast series that kind of does a deeper dive off each of the experiments I offer with an expert, because again, I'm just the friend who gets it, so I wanted to consciously curate a deeper dive. So that's in the works right now, and got about 24 episodes recorded already, and we're figuring it all out. As you know, that's a fun process. And then I'll give you for the show notes, but Addison Brazil like the country with an S, on Instagram and the usual places.
Awesome. Addison, thank you so much. And what a gift you are giving to the world, to humanity, of sharing with authenticity, vulnerability, and candor what you've experienced so that others can heal and grow. It's really, um, yeah, it's amazing. And my gratitude, and I'm sure many other people's gratitude to you for that. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, listener, if you can think of someone in your life who could benefit from this, get them the book. And if you need it yourself, get the book. We'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.